I want to play a game. Every time I present a piece of evidence today, don't listen to me. Listen to what happens next. I'll mention a documented disparity, and sometimes I'll change the subject. I'll mention a study, and somebody will make it about intentions. I'll mention policy, and somebody will make it about personalities. By the end of this episode, I want you to ask yourself one question. Why is it so hard for us to stay with the evidence? Not because disagreement is bad. Disagreement is healthy. Deflection isn't. Because every moment we spend arguing about whether someone feels accused is another minute we don't spend solving the problem that started the conversation. And people pay the price for that. Not in feelings, in lives. So today, we're not talking about whether you're a good person. We're talking about what happens when evidence collides with identity. Because if we can't stay with the evidence, we'll never solve the problem the evidence is pointing to. Welcome to You Oughta Know Betta, the podcast where we read the fine print, check the receipts, and investigate the asterisk. I'm AJ Miller. You might know me as Unicorn. Let's get into it. Before we talk about politics, let's talk about people. Because this isn't just a political problem. It's a human one. In 1990, a psychologist by the name of Dr. Ziva Kunda published one of the most influential papers in social psychology, The Case for Motivated Reasoning. And her conclusion? Human beings often don't start with the evidence. We start with the conclusion we want. Then our brains go looking for reasons to support it. That's motivated reasoning. Then you have Dr. Dan Kahan at Yale Law School. His research on identity protective cognition found that when information threatens a group's identity, people often become more likely to defend the group than evaluate the evidence itself. Think about that. If evidence feels like it's criticizing, quote, my people, my side, or people like me, the instinct isn't always curiosity. It's protection. Psychologist Dr. John Jost, Dr. Mahzarin Banaji developed system justification theory. Their research says that people are often motivated to defend existing social systems because believing the system is fundamentally fair feels safer than questioning it. Now put those ideas together. Motivated reasoning, identity protective cognition, and system justification. What do you get? A recipe for deflection. Not because people are stupid. Not because people are incapable of growth. Because our brains often try to protect our identity before they pursue uncomfortable truths. Here's the problem. That instinct might protect our ego, but it doesn't solve public policy. Hospitals don't care about your identity. Housing policy doesn't care about your identity. The justice system cares about your identity. And there's a sector of deflection that refuses to solve that. But we'll talk about that later. Right now, The outcomes are the outcomes. So let's test the theory. Let's see what happens when evidence enters the room. According to the CDC, Black women in the United States are several times more likely than white women to die from pregnancy-related causes. Researchers found that this disparity persists even after accounting for factors such as income and education. That's the evidence. Now notice what often happens next. Do we ask, why is this happening? Or do we immediately ask, are you saying doctors are racist? Those are two completely different questions. One examines a documented disparity. The other redirects the conversation away from the disparity. And that's today's episode. Not disagreement, deflection. Because if we never stay with the original question, we never solve the original problem. Now let's move on to housing. Because if you want to understand wealth in America, you have to understand home ownership. For most Americans, a home isn't just where you live. It's the biggest investment you'll ever make. It's how equity is built, how businesses get started. It's how colleges get paid for. It's how wealth gets passed from one generation to the next. In the 1930s, the Homeowners Loan Corporation created residential security maps that graded neighborhoods for mortgage lending risk. Neighborhoods with large Black populations were often rated as hazardous, and those maps influenced lending decisions for decades. Historians, the National Archives, and decades of scholarship have documented how these practices help limit access to federally backed mortgages for many Black families. Then came the GI Bill. While the law itself didn't explicitly exclude Black veterans, many benefits were administered locally. In practice, discriminatory lending, segregation, and unequal access meant many Black veterans were unable to receive the same housing opportunities as white veterans. So here's the question. If one group had greater access to appreciating property for decades, and another group faced substantial barriers to that same opportunity, would you expect those families to have the same accumulated wealth generations later? The Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances consistently found large racial wealth gaps in the United States. Now, watch what happens next. Hold on to that receipt. Because instead of asking, how did those housing policies affect generational wealth? The conversation often becomes, well, my family was poor too. Maybe they were. That doesn't answer the question. Both things can be true. Your family may have struggled. And discriminatory housing policies may have shaped opportunities for millions of Americans. Those aren't competing facts. They're different facts. Notice the pattern? We moved from a discussion about documented federal housing policy to a discussion about individual family stories. That's deflection. Not because individual stories don't matter. They do. But personal anecdotes can erase population-level evidence. Political psychologists would tell us this in exactly what identity protective reasoning looks like. When evidence feels personal, we often respond with our own personal story. The problem is, public policy isn't evaluated one anecdote at a time. It's evaluated by looking at patterns. That's why researchers study populations. That's why historians examine archives. That's why economists analyze decades of data. Because they're trying to answer a policy question, not settle an argument at the family reunion. And here's the cost. If we spend all our time debating whose grandparents had it harder, we never examine whether past housing policy continues to influence opportunity today. The conversation shifts. The policy disappears. And once the policy disappears, so does the possibility of fixing it. That's the cost of deflection. Not that someone won an argument, that a documented problem never got the attention it deserved. All right, let's try another one. In 2017, the U.S. Sentencing Commission published a comprehensive report examining sentencing in the federal courts. After accounting for factors like criminal history, offense characteristics, and other legally relevant variables, the commission found that black men received sentences that were on average about 19% longer than similarly situated white men. Not Twitter, not TikTok. The United States Sentencing Commission. That's the receipt. Now, watch what happens next. Instead of asking, why does this disparity exist? The conversation often becomes, well, what about black on black crime? That's a different conversation. Violence within communities is real. And proximity crime says every race kills at about the same rate. Victims deserve justice. Communities deserve safety. But neighborhood crime patterns don't answer whether simply situated defendants receive different sentences in federal court. Those are separate questions. When one question gets replaced with another, the first question never gets answered. That's deflection. And when the question never gets answered, the policy rarely gets examined, which means the disparity remains. Watch what happens next. So let's keep going. Public education. One of the greatest promises America ever made. The idea that no matter where you're born, you should have the opportunity to learn. Now here's the receipt. The U.S. Department of Education, the Government Accountability Office, and decades of education researchers have documented that schools serving larger portions of students of color and students from low-income families are more likely to experience concentrated poverty and resource disparities. School funding systems vary by state, but in many places, local property wealth still plays a big role in what schools can provide. That's the receipt. Now, watch what happens next. Instead of asking, why do these disparities exist? The conversation becomes, well, if parents cared more, maybe parental involvement matters. Research says it does. But that still doesn't answer the question. If one school has advanced placement courses, new science labs, experienced teachers, a functioning library, smaller class sizes, and another school is struggling to provide those same opportunities, asking why isn't an attack, it's accountability. Because here's the thing we love telling children. You can be anything you want to be. But opportunity isn't just about talent. It's also about access. Access to experienced teachers, access to rigorous coursework, access to counselors, access to technology, access to safe learning environments. Those things matter. The research has been saying they matter for decades. So watch what happens next. When someone asks why educational opportunities aren't distributed equally, do we investigate the policies? Or do we immediately make it about individual character? Because if we reduce every policy discussion to individual choices, we'll never ask whether the system itself can be improved. And if we never ask, we never fix it. Watch what happens next. By now, I hope you've noticed the pattern. It wasn't about one issue. It wasn't about one policy. It wasn't even about one political party. The pattern was the response. Present the evidence. Watch what happens next. Change the subject. Question the motive. Debate the messenger. Protect the identity. And forget the original question. Over and over and over again. Here's why that matters. Public policy only changes when the public agrees there's a problem we're solving. If the conversation never stays on the problem, nothing changes. If every discussion about maternal mortality becomes a debate about intentions, the mothers are still dying. If every discussion about housing becomes a debate about individual success stories, families are still living with the consequences of decades of documented policy. If every discussion about sentencing disparities becomes a debate about something else, the justice system never has to answer the original question. If every discussion about violent extremism becomes an argument about whether talking about it is divisive, the threat doesn't disappear. The conversation does. That's why deflection isn't harmless. It consumes the time we should be spending solving problems. Think about it. How many times have you watched an interview where someone was asked a direct question and somehow, 5 minutes later, nobody remembers what the original question was? Politics, media, social media, they're all full of that. Outrage gets clicks. Deflection gets applause. Answers? Not so much. And that's dangerous. Because democracy depends on an informed public, not a distracted one. So the next time you hear someone present evidence, pause. Before you decide whether you agree, before you decide whether you disagree, ask yourself one question. Did we stay with the evidence? Or did we leave it behind? Because if we can't stay with the evidence, we can't follow it. If we can't follow it, we can't understand it. And if we can't understand it, we have no chance of fixing what's broken. That's why this matters. Not because it's comfortable. Not because it's easy. But because people are living with the consequences, while the rest of us argue about whether we should even be having the conversation. The receipts don't care who they make uncomfortable. They're receipts. Our job isn't to protect ourselves from the evidence. Our job is to have the courage to examine it. That's how problems get solved. That's how policy gets better. And that's how democracy is supposed to work. At the beginning of this episode, I told you we were going to play a game. Not to see whether you agreed with me, not to see whether you changed your political party, not to see whether you liked me. I asked you to watch for a pattern, a piece of evidence, a change of subject, a question left unanswered, then another, and another. The point wasn't that every disagreement is deflection. People should disagree. People should challenge evidence. People should ask hard questions. That's how democracy works. But there's a difference between challenging evidence and refusing to engage with it. There's a difference between asking for more proof and changing the subject before the proof is even discussed. Because here's the thing. Evidence doesn't ask us to surrender our identity. It asks us to examine reality. Sometimes reality confirms what we already believed. Sometimes it challenges us. That's true whether we're talking about race, healthcare, education, criminal justice, housing, or any other issue that might shape a person's life. The question isn't whether the conversation makes us comfortable. The question is whether it moves us closer to the truth. Because truth doesn't become less true because it makes us uncomfortable. And it doesn't become more false because someone changed the subject. So the next time you're watching the news, listening to a debate, scrolling through social media, or sitting across from someone at dinner, don't just listen to what's being said. Pay attention to what happens after the evidence is presented. Did the conversation stay with the question, or did it run from it? Because if we keep running from the evidence, we'll keep running from the solutions. And people living with the consequences of those problems don't have that luxury. This has been You Oughta Know Betta. I'm AJ Miller. You might know me as Unicorn. Thank you for reading the fine print with me, checking the receipts, and investigating the asterisks. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and the next time someone presents evidence, watch what happens next. Good night.